So I think we can go ahead and get started. Um, Thank you to David and Christine for presenting their Summer Scholar work to us today. This is the first of our Summer Scholar presentations this year, so we're glad to get started. So David Johnson is an associate professor of multilingual education at the College of Education. And his research focuses on how language policies impact educational opportunities for students in bilingual education and English language education, if I have that right. And Christine Shea is an associate professor in the departments of linguistics and Spanish and Portuguese. Dr. Shea focuses on issues related to bilingualism and language acquisition. So their Summer Scholars project this summer is entitled Language Policies and Programs for Heritage Spanish Speakers in Iowa. It's a mouthful. So thank you both very much for applying for the program this summer and for presenting your work to date.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for coming online and in person. It's interesting to be around actual people on the University of Iowa campus. It's been a while. We hosted a professional development workshop for teachers a few weeks ago as a part of a grant project. This is the first time I've been around in a different university building and with other people. So it's fun. It's nice to see people. It's nice to see anyone. Yeah, so the title of our project and our talk today is Language Policies and Programs for Heritage Spanish Speakers in Iowa. So what we have in mind, this isn't working. Try now. Yeah. I'll talk for a little bit and then Christine's going to talk for a little bit. We divided up the presentation into two parts around the first focusing on the sort of conceptual and theoretical background in language policy, and the second focusing on what we mean by heritage Spanish speakers and the sort of focus of our research. I want to introduce our team. So Christine and I were introduced, but also we have two graduate assistants, Diana Camberos from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, and Melanie Carbine from the Department of Teaching and Learning, who have been amazing. We've been working together this summer, meeting regularly via Zoom. We're really grateful for this opportunity. It's really interesting to come together. You mentioned the interdisciplinarity of the center, but definitely this is an interdisciplinary project. So it's been really engaging and interesting, and I think it's just the start. So I think what we want to talk about today is the conceptualization of the project, kind of where we're coming from. I mean, I think one question might be, what's a language policy? This is an epistemological and theoretically diverse group of folks in the room and on Zoom and in the center. And so I think maybe we should explain a little bit about where we're coming from with this project. We have two research questions. I'm kind of going to address the first a little bit, and Christine will address the second, sort of. It kind of aligns that way. But the first part will be about language policy and planning, definitions and examples. And then Christine will talk about heritage language learners, identity, ideology, and education. So the questions are, what language policies and programs guide the education of heritage Spanish speakers in Iowa? And what rationales and ideologies engender the implementation of these policies and programs? So one natural first question that some of you might have is, what is language policy? So I want to present very briefly some examples and definitions. So I start in Singapore, a context, a policy context I happen to be interested in and have written about. So this is an example of an implementation of an official quadrilingual language policy. Singapore has 4 official languages: English, Chinese, Tamil, and Malay. This danger sign kind of represents what the official languages are. You need to have the official languages on this type of sign, but also the hierarchy of the languages, which with English at the top, Chinese second, and then Tamil and Malay below. And that's sort of, so this is kind of gives you an indication of the role and status of the languages in Singapore. A more local example, and we're thinking about something more local. So the quadrilingual language policy from Singapore is national. This is from a restaurant in town here in Iowa City. something more local, something, the quadrilingual language policy being explicit, but we also think about language policies that they can be implicit. And so this sort of shows the multi-layeredness of language policy. These are signs that are advertising for people to work in this restaurant. You'll notice they use different languages for different positions. So Spanish for washing dishes, Korean, Hangul for servers, right? And then for some reason, English for busboy. I think maybe it's just easier to say in English, I'm not sure. But so this represents, I would argue, a language policy of the business that they require Korean proficiency, or at least they want English proficiency if you want to work as a server in the restaurant. So it's a problematic language policy, an implicit language policy. Of course, nowhere are they posting this language policy. It's not explicit or official or anything like that. So a little bit about the background of the field. It sort of emerges in the 50s and 60s among linguists who have been invited to consult countries and polities on language planning and policy initiatives. They coalesce into a kind of a field. It's like all these people start to get together after these initiatives. So it's something that people did first, and only later something that people studied. So from that early work, they created this tripartite conceptualization of corpus planning, which is the focus on language forms. So writing systems, for example, how do we create a written language? How do we create a writing system for a language that was heretofore not written? What should be included in the dictionary? How do we modernize the lexicon, et cetera? Status planning focuses on the functions of the language. So what language should we use in government? What should we use in the media? What should we use in schools? How do we make those decisions? What decisions do we make about those considerations? An aspect of status planning, acquisition planning, focusing more on education. So what languages should we include in schools, but also how should they be taught? And so acquisition planning is sort of the area in which this project is. This is a long definition. I'm not going to talk about all of it. This is from my 2013 book on language policy. Just want to point out this, or sort of summarize that we conceptualize language policy as official regulations. So there are these official texts that are written, intended to affect some change in the form, function, use, or acquisition of language. But we also think about unofficial, covert, de facto, and implicit mechanisms across multiple layers of language policy creation, interpretation, and appropriation. They're not just products, they're processes and can be studied as such. Importantly, influenced by the ideologies and discourses in a particular context, in a societal context, in a school context, right? So how language policies are created, how they're interpreted by, let's say, administrators in a school district, and then how they're implemented in a school district is impacted by the language ideologies, the discourses circulated in that unique context. Same at the federal level. So it's a multi-layered, it's an ideological layering. So the sort of ideology circulating in Congress, for example, at a particular period in time, I would argue impact how language policy is crafted and formed. So that connection between language ideology and language policy. So by and large, language policy has been throughout US history to marginalize and minoritize language users, languages and their use. So here are just some quick examples. Indian boarding schools, which didn't go out of existence until the middle part of the 20th century, were used to convert Indian kids to Christianity, to assimilate them, to learn English. They would have to cut their hair, et cetera. So there was that's an example of a language policy. The 1906 Naturalization Act, which requires English for US citizenship, that still happens till this day, I would argue is a product of historical policies going back a long ways that were intentionally trying to prevent particular types of immigrants coming to the US, leading up to this 1906 Naturalization Act. Focusing on Iowa very quickly, a very interesting language policy in the history of Iowa, the only place this has ever happened in the United States. The Babel Proclamation outlawed the use of all foreign languages, completely unconstitutional. It only lasted about a year when it was struck down, but it was approved by the Governor Harding at the time, and Teddy Roosevelt was a fan in 1907, speaking before this. He says we have room for but one flag, we have room for but one language. The Iowa Supreme Court in 1921. So there is this sense, and the focus with the Babel Proclamation was probably German, because it was happening around the World Wars. The languages change, the focus of the policies change, but the mechanisms stay somewhat the same, I would argue, historically. And I think we can trace that to this day when we look at, for example, official English policies, which I'll talk about in just a second. There is this idea, for example, as the Iowa Supreme Court says in a case that was brought against a German teacher in Iowa, that the harmful effects of non-American ideas are inculcated through the teaching of foreign languages. So there is this idea throughout US history that in order to be truly American, so to speak, you have to speak English. And these foreign languages not only are sort of like conduits for foreign ideas, which are harmful for the US, for the unity of the US. On the other hand, language policy can be used for linguistic pluralism and social justice efforts. And here are some different projects from around the world. For example, the 1972 Peru Bilingual Education Project, which promoted the use of Quechua in schools, still does to this day. The 1987 Maori Language Act in New Zealand, which officialized the Maori language and created the opportunity for Maori language schools throughout the country. The 1991 Sami Language Act. Sami is an indigenous language that transcends Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Opened up space for Sami language schools and instruction in Finland. And the 1968, let's focus on the US, the 1968 Bilingual Education Act, or Title VII of the US Elementary and Secondary Education Act, created funding opportunities, ideological and implementational spaces for multilingual education in US schools. I don't want to go over all of these, but just to get a sense for, well, what did that mean? So there are different types. So you have to do something for kids who speak a language other than English or qualify for these services. There are many different types of programs. You can categorize them as English as a second language, or by the focus being, of course, just acquisition of English, or bilingual education, the focus being the acquisition of two languages. And there are different models for each of those. We think about these models and language policies in general as having a problem, right, or resource orientation. So how do we view languages and language planning and policy initiatives? Do we think about them as problems? This has been historically the case, that non-English languages represent a problem, a roadblock for kids when they come to school. It's something to overcome. You can think about it as a right. The linguistic human rights is a subject of research and activism and advocacy around the world. Thinking about language, the native language of kids, as a basic human right. That when kids go to school, they have the right to be educated in the language that they speak at home. Or language as resource orientation, which envisions linguistic diversity and multilingual education as resources for everyone. Now, these things aren't mutually exclusive, either within the policy or within an individual. Like an individual can have multiple ideas at the same time, but it is sort of a helpful guide in trying to, when we characterize different language plans and policies. So let me say quickly a few things about language policy. Let's focus on Iowa. This is to give you a sense for the number of, so the term it used to be limited English proficient, which is a very deficit term. It's become English language learners. The feds increasingly are using the term English learners. So these are kids, again, who don't speak English, who speak English as an L2, and a second language, and qualify for these services. And you can kind of get a sense for where Iowa is. It's below the national average, which is around 10%. So in Iowa, this is from 2018 to Iowa is about 6.5%. However, as you might expect, throughout the country, Spanish is by far the most common first language, followed by Arabic and Chinese. Something that I think is important to always point out in presentations like this, most English language learners are born in the US. Okay, so this is not, especially in the elementary grades, the vast majority of these students are not first generation immigrant students or second generation immigrant students. In Iowa, while the numbers are relatively low. And I always talk about Iowa as, the linguistic diversity that has grown in Iowa. We tend to talk about it as something new. Now, I want to say before European colonization, there were many different indigenous languages spoken in the territory that's now called Iowa, including the name from which we get the name of the state, Iowa, the Iowa language. So there was linguistic diversity here before European colonization. That said, uh, over the past 20 years especially, we've seen an increasing growth in the number of English learners in schools who are by and large Spanish speakers. It's increased by about 250% over the past 20 years, and whereas nationally it's about only 30%. The number of native English speakers has actually decreased. Some school districts, like for example, the small school district Denison went from like 4% English learners to 20 to now 48, probably more than 50% now. So there's this rapid growth in the linguistic ecology, and the challenge of accommodating this changing linguistic ecology in the schools, and so we're interested in how educators and policymakers are adapting to that change.
Like when you're talking about Denison and that big change, again, is that mostly kids that have been born in Iowa to parents who are new immigrants? And that's that same situation, would you say there?
Probably not, actually. Actually, I think that's probably a different situation. I think it is people immigrated to, I think, I don't know for sure, but I think that is that is new immigration.
I think we could probably say it would depend on the community, because there are other communities. Marshalltown, for example, has more of the case of what you mentioned earlier, David, of kids who were born in the United States but grew up, say, speaking Spanish at home, and that's what I'll talk about in my part. But yes.
And West Liberty too. It's a long-standing Spanish-speaking community, but Denison's newer, so yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So some folks have described it as the new Latino diaspora in Iowa. You might have seen this sign in the newspaper. Someone spray painted Mexico over the Marshalltown sign. This is indicating, I would argue, some of the tension, racism, perhaps, depending on the intentions of the author, take place. What the I call him the author of the spray painting, the artist. What they didn't know was they were joining a genre actually of defacing welcome signs. This one is interesting because it represents a town, Hereford, England, which had recently experienced some Polish immigration. So it's the same sort of idea. English is the official language of Iowa, passed in 2001 or 2002, sorry. This is from US English, which is an organization, the largest organization, which the goal of which is to make English the official language of the United States. So, I mean, we could talk about this for what we're not, we don't, but it's a multilingual sign. For me, it represents an interesting multilingual mix. Like, it's a good example of code switching, actually. But I think it's intended to scare people and scare these kids or something. I'm not sure. But anyway, this law encourages the assimilation of Iowans into Iowa's rich culture. What do they mean by Iowans here? What do they mean by Iowa's rich culture? Good questions. But anyway, the English is the official language of Iowa. Usually these policies, these official English policies, are pretty vacuous. They're not intended to affect education, for example. There's usually something in there about explicitly prohibiting them from doing so. They're often sort of like policies that exist and no one really thinks much about until when they're passed. However, in the state of Iowa, it did have a distinct impact. One impact in general, there was a court case brought by Steve King against the then Secretary of State, Michael Mauro, at the time in 2007, who had voter registration forms on the secretary's website in Spanish, Vietnamese, Laotian, and Bosnian. They were brought to court. They used the official English policy as the rationale. The judge agreed, and they were forced to take down the voter registration forms in these different languages. I think the fact that it happened in 2007, right before an election year, is not coincidental or anything like that. And then you get King and another litigant in the case was Joni Ernst, arguing that basically, encouraging multilingualism discourages unity, and this monoglot ideology, the notion that you need to speak the same language in order to be unified. I mean, it goes against the idea that, for example, India is the largest democracy in the world, but it's still multilingual. And then we had a civil war where we all spoke the same language, but we had a civil war. Anyway, but still, that ideology, that idea about language circulates.
And this is still true. There still is no voter registration forms in other languages.
I don't think there is. I haven't, yeah.
Yeah.
So now we're going to transition. So I need to stop sharing screens. I think you can share now, Christine. Should I mute us?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So let me. There we go. Okay. So can you see my screen? Everything is fine? Yes?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay. And you can hear me? Everything is good? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. Then, okay, so David gave us a brief overview then of language policies and how they are sort of conceptualized at a broader level. So I'm going to cover the next part of our project, which is a little bit kind of narrowing in a little bit more on exactly what do we mean by heritage speakers of Spanish, and why is their Spanish language education a policy issue. So in brief, David alluded to this in his part. A heritage language is a language that an individual is exposed to during childhood, usually in the home. And crucially, it is not the dominant language of a society. So for example, Spanish is a heritage language in the US, English is the dominant language, but you could imagine, say, Turkish is a heritage language in Germany. I'm up here in Canada, we have Punjabi, we have Mandarin, we have Cantonese, we have all sorts of other languages where English is the dominant language and others are considered to be heritage languages. So a heritage language speaker is a person who grew up hearing and possibly speaking a language, who can understand and perhaps speak it to some degree, but who now, crucially, this is an important point here, who now feels more at home in another, more dominant language. So heritage speakers are bilinguals, but they are different from other types of bilinguals. And I see there are a couple of comments in the chat. Let me see here. Okay. We can get to that in a second then. So in other words, then, heritage speakers are not the same as people who are bilingual from birth and use both languages all the time, but nor are they the same as late second language learners who learn their second language at an older age. So we can think of it sort of like this, where L1 is the first language, L2 is the second language, and then heritage language learners are kind of in the middle here, if you want. It's a little simplified, but it's sort of this idea, where they learned it at an early age, but then they switched dominance into what was at one point their L2, but now can be considered their more dominant and more sort of comfortable language, if you want. So why does this switch happen? Or why rather are heritage learners sort of in the middle here? Well, they receive a different amount and type of input. But importantly, what differs them from second language learners is that they are in a context of what we call naturalistic learning. That is, they acquired their heritage language through contact with their family and not in a classroom context. And then they are different rather from the L1 speakers because they are non-dominant in that heritage language. And this can show up in terms of vocabulary knowledge, in terms of certain grammatical aspects of the way they use their heritage language, and sometimes even pronunciation, although phonetics and phonology tend to be relatively more impervious if you want to later learning effects. Just trying to see if there are any other. Okay, so I wanted to, I'm going to do a very anti-PowerPoint technique thing here, and I'm going to read this quote to you all because I just find that it captures a lot of what we talk about when we talk about heritage bilingual experience. And it's from an author, Julie Sedevi, who's a psycholinguist, and she's a heritage speaker of Czech. So she says here, embracing the dominant language comes at a price. Like a household that welcomes a new child, a single mind can't admit a new language without some impact on other languages already residing there. Languages can coexist, but they tussle, as do siblings, over mental resources and attention. When a bilingual person tries to articulate a thought in one language, words and grammatical structures from the other language often clamor in the background, jostling for attention. I love that metaphor. The subconscious effort of suppressing this competition can slow the retrieval of words. And if the background language elbows its way to the forefront, the speaker may resort to code switching, plunking down a word from one language into the sentence frame of another. Meanwhile, the weaker language is more likely to become swamped. When resources are scarce, and by resources we mean input, as they are during mental exhaustion, the disadvantaged language may become nearly impossible to summon. And over time, neglecting an earlier language makes it harder and harder for it to compete for access. So that's a very nice summary sort of the psycholinguistic process of being a bilingual and then becoming dominant in one language over the other. So related to this then is this intricate connection between language and identity. So when we're talking about heritage speakers, typically the heritage language is lost, i.e. not used in daily interactions, not spoken, not understood by typically around the third generation after arrival in the United States. And that's a statistic I have read regarding Spanish speakers, even with the tremendous number of Spanish speakers in the United States. So the pressure to assimilate linguistically is very high. However, in the case of Spanish heritage speakers, even if they may not be speaking the language every day or all day, they still do not lose their identity as Latinos. So ethnically or racially, they are still considered Latino, regarded as Latino, and treated as such by society at large. So that has important implications for what we're going to discuss a few slides along the way here. So another important point is the Spanish that is spoken by heritage speakers. It reflects the variety spoken in their family's country of origin, because when you think about from whom are they learning Spanish, they're learning it from their family. And it is not typically the educated norm. So it's not necessarily the Spanish that you would hear spoken in a university classroom in Mexico City, for example, or even on the news, say from El Salvador, if you want. It is typically regionally marked, and often is the variety spoken by individuals without necessarily high levels of formal education. And I emphasize formal education. So what are the implications of this then for, say, the Spanish classroom? Well, in linguistic terms, heritage speakers exhibit what is known as or called interrupted acquisition, in the sense that they were, many of them, monolingual up until they were about 5 or 6 years of age, and then they had this dominant switch. And in terms of sociolinguistics, the variety of Spanish that they speak, again, is not necessarily the type of Spanish that is taught in your regular Spanish classroom, and particularly by non-native speakers of Spanish who are teachers. So this leads to certain challenges for teachers and administrators in the classroom when working with heritage speakers. So one other important point that relates to this is what is called the standard language ideology. And standard language ideology in a nutshell basically is those who speak the standard are intellectually and morally superior to those who speak a non-standard variety. And I didn't put down where that was cited from, excuse me. But the idea here is that those who speak correctly, right, have a higher status in society than those who speak incorrectly. Now, the question, of course, is who decides what is correct and incorrect, right? There is no inherent value to one language over another. So linguistic practices reflect and perpetuate social norms. Language can serve as a tool for social differentiation. And we don't even have to talk about different languages. We can talk about languages, different varieties of English, for example, if we hear Southern US English versus Upper Midwest English, or Bronx, New York English versus Texan English. In the US, standard language ideology is connected to the ideal white, monolingual, educated speaker. And I say from somewhere, because I don't know if this speaker actually really does exist. So again, the standard language ideology is as a consequence of this, racialized populations are systematically stigmatized, regardless of the extent to which their linguistic practices correspond to standardized norms. And this is something David and I and our group have talked about extensively over the summer. This is what is called ratiolinguistics, and it's from scholars Flores and Rosa. And the idea here is that it basically doesn't matter how well you speak Spanish or how well you speak English. You are still Latino. So this is related to this point here, in the sense of it matters who is bilingual, right? The symbolic value of a language, as we said, is not intrinsic to that language. For example, non-Latino students who have made the effort to learn Spanish are viewed differently than Latino students who speak Spanish and have made the effort to maintain it. right? And this relates directly back to this idea of racial linguistics. It's not just the fact that you're bilingual, it is who is bilingual, who is bilingual. So this relates to sort of a whole field of study where we think about language through a critical lens, right? So this means that we examine the relationship between social and political structures, which can be called language ideologies. And this is a cultural system of ideas about social and linguistic relationships that in turn affect individual beliefs and attitudes. So we have ideologies that affect individuals in terms of their beliefs and attitudes, right? And this can lead to policy, or policy can interact with this, or policy can drive this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a one-way, all the time, a one-way relationship. So as I say, together, these interact in intricate and traceable ways with language policy. So society's attitude towards speakers is reflected in its attitudes towards their language. Thus, we would argue speech is an urgent social justice issue. So to summarize then, Latino students are at once stigmatized because they don't speak standard Spanish or standard English. And heritage language classes are classes specifically designed for these students, and that they can be a space to address this reality and also address the challenges that this reality represents. So our goals then again, what language policies and programs guide the education of heritage Spanish speakers in Iowa, and what rationales and ideologies engender the implementation of these policies and programs. So sort of in more detail then, the overarching goal of our project is to examine how high schools across the state in areas where there is a high Latino presence view these students as Spanish language speakers. Are there separate classes for them, right? And remember, they're not L1, they're not monolingual Spanish speakers, nor are they L2 speakers of Spanish. And how do teachers and administrators view the Spanish heritage speakers speak, right? Remember, they are not formally educated in Spanish, and they speak a non-standard variety of the language. And also, how do teachers and administrators view teaching Spanish to students who already speak it? You often hear that. So a little bit of background, this is just following up on some of the information that David presented. The blue states, if you want, are populations, are Latinos as a percentage of the population between 5 and 10%. And the green counties are 10% or more. Okay, so we have, for example, Sioux County here, 11.2%, Woodbury 17, right? Buena Vista up to 28, I think, if I can read that properly, and Marshall 23. Okay, so that's about a quarter of the population. So this is just some information that we collected from state databases. So 130,407, the number of Iowa residents age 5 and older in 2019 who speak Spanish at home, okay, of whom almost 63% say they speak English very well, okay? And here Latinos constitute 6.3% of the state's total population. And the change, 140.7% between 2000 to 2019 in terms of the change in the percentage of presence of Latinos. And in terms of education, 60,631 Latino children are enrolled in the state's elementary and high schools, right? This represents a 266% increase. And then 7% of the total enrollment in the state's universities and colleges are students who identify as Latino. So in terms of heritage Spanish speakers here in Iowa, all Iowa high school students must take a foreign language. And for the University of Iowa, students have to have taken a language for 4 years. Otherwise, they have to take language classes at the university. So Spanish is by far the most commonly taught language across the state. So most students end up taking that as their option. And this has important implications for Spanish heritage speakers when they come to high school language classes. Right, so heritage Spanish speakers in the Spanish classroom have specific language needs and also cultural needs, right? You cannot teach a heritage Spanish speaker in the same way as you would teach a second language learner for 2 very important reasons. First of all, their type of language knowledge, the type of knowledge they have of Spanish is very different because of different acquisition trajectories. And then second, because of the cultural identity that heritage Spanish speakers share with the language, that a second language learner does not. So Spanish heritage speaker classes typically go beyond teaching things like verb conjugations and the scary subjunctive and such, right? They serve as places where students can share and relate to each other in terms of their family, background, and experiences, right? And again, this pulls us back to the comments earlier about racial linguistics. Regardless of how you speak, you are still Latino. And oh, just a side note here, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Iowa currently offers 5 courses focused on heritage Spanish speakers, their language classes. And we also offer a course focused on teaching heritage language speakers for future Spanish teachers in the state. And for many of the students who take these heritage Spanish speaker classes in our department, it is the first time that they have thought about their identity as heritage speakers. So it's kind of interesting. And that was another reason as well why we wanted to initiate this project, was to perhaps start this type of conversation a little bit earlier than first year of university. So again, just to remind us what our goals are, the languages, policies, and programs, and then the rationales and ideologies. So in terms of our methods then, we are in the process right now of designing a survey for teachers and admins. We're going to give the survey to principals and AEAs in high schools that serve communities with a high Latino presence. And there'll be obviously different versions of the survey for each one of those populations. And we're going to examine as well information that's publicly available, in terms of, we're going to do discourse analysis, of policy texts, the federal, the state, and the local level. And the survey at this point, anyway, what we're thinking will consist of 3 parts, right? We'll require demographic information, attitudes and perspectives on bilingualism, Latino bilingualism, and language learning, and then attitudes and perspectives on heritage speaker bilingualism. And then hopefully connect this information to what is available on the web, and also hopefully with some interviews with teachers, principals, and admins regarding Spanish heritage speaker education. And then finally, down the road, hopefully create a resource for the teachers, admins, and principals to use to guide policy at the state level and implementation of these classes at the district and the school levels. Okay, so these are the schools that currently, or the school districts rather, that currently have heritage Spanish classes. This is what Melanie and Diana have been working hard at. And I think that's all. Yeah, that's all we have for now. So thank you all very much. If you have any questions or comments.
Christine, can you hear us okay?
Yeah.
It's interesting you're doing this. Way back, I took an undergraduate class here in Italian American Heritage, and it wasn't the language, it was all these other things that you're talking about weaving around the language, which and it's really interesting, and there's some things that still kind of stuck from that. On the Spanish speaking side, I've heard in places like the West Liberty where you've got different generations of people and different places from where they came that look at each other very differently. Is that something that you try to tease out in this at all? So like you mentioned that after 3 generations, generally the language is going to drift off, maybe more, but a 3rd generation family in West Liberty versus a new immigrant family, and how that might factor into some of these things?
Yes, absolutely. Now, our initial plan right now is not to, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but our initial plan is not to speak directly to students or necessarily to parents. So that would be a question that would be interesting to say, ask teachers. Do you have students who have recently arrived from a Spanish speaking country? But typically those students wouldn't necessarily be taking a heritage Spanish class. They would be either an ELL or possibly another resource, but they probably wouldn't be necessarily channeled into these classes. And as for the different countries of origin, I can really only speak from personal experience, and I make sure that everybody understands this is personal experience. It's quite interesting when you have heritage speakers from different countries. I've seen this at the university. Sorry. So I've seen this at the university, and they'll compare things like, oh, where I'm from, we say it this way, where I'm from, we say it that way, we eat this, we eat that. But the shared Latino identity tends to take, or rather can take, at least in my experience, precedence over these differences. When it's within the group, individual differences in terms of where we come from might play out, but sort of facing outward, the shared experience tends to play a stronger role. Now, again, my experience. So, yeah. But I mean, complicated though, yes. So did we have some questions in the chat? Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. Anything else? Was it, I'm hoping it was clear, the connection between policy and why what we're trying to do is important.
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, the policy implications cut across so many different things.
Right.
The voter registration one, I had not realized in Iowa they had gotten rid of that. I mean, that's almost beyond belief.
Mm-hmm.
That we would do something like that with such a, and it's, again, many of these folks are citizens and have a right to vote, yet we're not going to allow them through policy to have easy access to voting.
It's sort of related to this question, actually. Is it an overstatement that the future of Iowa is multilingual and multicultural? Because I think the future of the United States, in fact, the current state of the United States is multilingual and multicultural. It's not a monolingual country. It's very multilingual. It's just that we don't have language policies that necessarily represent that on a national level. In the future of Iowa, it's interesting in Iowa, thinking about language policy in Iowa, because it's a state in which you can do what you want. There's not a lot of restriction placed on school districts about how they implement their language educational programs, where there is in other states like Arizona, for example, where they have an explicitly anti-bilingual education policy, also in Massachusetts. And it's a much more contentious issue. I don't get the sense that bilingual education, at least on a large scale, is necessarily contentious politically in the same way it is in other contexts. You can do what you want. So school districts have a lot of agency, we've found, to implement the types of programs that they want. However, there's not any support. So you can do what you want, but you have to figure it out on your own. So while they have a lot of, if you think about the classic dichotomy between structure and agency, they have a lot of agency, but actually, I would argue what's needed is more structure. That would help the future of Iowa being more multilingual and multicultural. These schools really need support, and they need to connect with one another. They sort of exist oftentimes in little communities like Denison or Storm Lake. They're kind of out there on their own. This is something that the participants will say, we're out there on our own. They need more of a community. So we're trying to do that within the College of Education in a grant-funded project from the Department of Education called Excel in Iowa, where we're providing professional development and connecting these educators. But I think the future depends on those educational initiatives and the political will. There's not a lot of political will in Des Moines regarding more funding for, when this comes up, they never want to give more funding for these students. So there is a sense in which that we just need to keep doing what we've been doing. And if these kids want to learn English, they should just be submerged into English.
In your survey, are you getting at any contentiousness at the local level? Because that's where I would suspect in Iowa it's more likely to happen than at the state level, at least right now.
What do you think, Christine?
I hadn't envisioned this survey as getting at contentious issues, I'll be honest with you, because we really don't know enough about what's going on in these classrooms and what the attitudes and ideologies of the teachers who are teaching these classes might be. So there might very well be, I've had personal contact with heritage Spanish teachers in Marshalltown and also in Des Moines. And they, as David said, they have very, very, very little support from anybody. They're very much flying by the seat of their pants on this and doing their best, as most teachers do. They're working extremely hard. So I would be surprised at the teacher level if there is anything contentious. Even at the principal level, I'd be surprised. And then I'm not sure if we would find negative attitudes. But again, it's the resource issue, isn't
Well,
it?
I think it would depend on who we survey. So for example, in Marshalltown, there's a bilingual school, Woodbury. It's the elementary school that's the bilingual school, and they refer to it as that Spanish school. Other teachers and other in the district and community members. It was a school, by the way, that was ravaged by that tornado that went through Marshalltown. Like that was the neighborhood that got hit the worst. But the survey isn't focused on those folks, actually. So I think that Christine's right. I think
Yeah.
find contentiousness, as you suggest, locally for sure, within the community, perhaps even within the school, these programs tend to be the programs for these kids tend to be marginalized. It's like what they do. It's for those kids. It's interesting to listen to the pronouns that they use for us as discourse analyzers. And I have a student who recently completed his dissertation in Marshalltown, and that was one of the quotes was, "It's that Spanish school," about so.
John, did you have a question? Yes, sorry.
I did, and I actually wrote this in the chat notes, and I
Mhm.
wanted to thank you and David for doing this presentation and doing this research. But I just had an anecdotal Denison story, which is sometime in the aughts, I was part of a University of Iowa faculty engagement tour, something that regrettably has been discontinued, but it got Johnson County professors out into the state. But when we visited Denison, we learned that the local economy is very much the health of the local economy is very much dependent on immigrant workers in meat processing, and the school district was even more dependent on their children. So, and when we visited the high school, the principal and I think the chief administrator, they were very candid about, kind of xenophobia and an embrace. Like without these students, the school district would have needed to shutter elementary schools, and just think it really points to the importance for policy. So I just wanted to throw that in and thank you for the work you all are doing.
Well, I think if we'd had like 2 hours, we could have gone into this other point in more detail. But one thing that often comes up in a lot of conversations with people is the idea of, well, if you speak Spanish, you'll get a better job, right? This idea of, we say in sociolinguistics, we talk about the commodification of language. And one of the things that we've been talking about over the summer with this grant is the idea that these heritage speaker classes go much, much, much beyond that, and that is where we might possibly touch on controversial topics. I don't know, we will see, but that's down the road, because the idea of classes for heritage Spanish speakers is not to improve their Spanish. The idea is to have students together who share similar cultural backgrounds, whether they are perfectly bilingual, whatever that means or not, but have them together in a classroom, sharing experiences, and positive and negative experiences in a classroom. So what will be interesting with our survey is to see how much of that side of the goal is achieved or valued in these classes as they are currently being carried out. Because teaching Spanish to heritage speakers is an extremely complicated topic, and it's very politically and culturally weighted. What variety, how, et cetera, et cetera. So that is sort of not the goal of this. Now, that's not directly related to what you said, John. It was more back to what I think Peter was asking in the beginning in terms of potentially controversial topics. We'll see what it is that people consider teaching and how much of that is related to what we can glean from available documents and discourse analyses, as David said.
If I could just throw one other thing in, and it refers to my former question about Iowa's future as a multicultural, multilingual state. I now live in California, where there is no majority population. We're spread out, and the University of California similarly has no 50% population. But I'm on day 300 or so of Duolingo Spanish studies. And if anything, I mean, I feel a certain amount of shame that it's taken me this long to take on knowing Spanish, but it's also made me realize how much I'm already living in an intensely multilingual environment. And I think that will happen in Iowa.
Absolutely.
And this is a detail, but when I first came to Iowa in 2002, there was very little evidence of culture, of Latinx culture in Iowa. And now La Regia is like the best Mexican restaurant I've eaten in outside of Mexico. There's an embrace and a prominence and a visibility that will come.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that is currently spoken of a lot, actually, in Spanish and Portuguese departments across universities in the United States is whether we should even be calling Spanish a foreign language. I don't think we should. It's not a foreign language. It's not a foreign language in the United States. There are people who are Spanish speakers in their families who've been in the United States territory for hundreds of years. But even if that weren't the case, it is not a foreign language, and it shouldn't be looked at as a foreign language. And then that also ties in again to the issue of the type of Spanish that is taught in classrooms to second language learners and etc. So anyway, yes, thank you. Thank you, John. Those are great comments.
Conceivably, I would have a follow-up question about Spanglish, which at least in California is increasingly being recognized as its own distinct language type. I don't know if you all are looking at that or not.
Yes, that will definitely be part of our survey. We're planning on having questions related to teacher attitudes and beliefs regarding mixing languages, which is also, to be honest with you, a bit of a political and policy stance. For a child who is growing up in a bilingual community with bilingual family members, are they really mixing two languages? Or are they using the communicative tools that they have at their disposal, right? Because those are two very different things. I mean, in my personal case, I learned Spanish as an adult. When I mix Spanish and English, it's usually because I don't know the word in Spanish. Whereas for children who grew up bilingual, for adults who grew up bilingually, mixing is natural. That is the way that we speak. So yes, as we have more and more bilinguals in the United States, the reality of Spanglish, if we want to call it that, will just grow as well. And also, I think the way people look at it. Sorry.
It's an example of linguistic innovation.
Right.
So as linguists, we're interested in that innovation, as other folks tend to be critical of people are always critical of linguistic innovation. Language is constantly changing. The only languages that don't change are languages that are no longer spoken. Ancient Greek is going to change anytime soon. Neither is Latin. But certainly Spanish and English are growing and evolving in contact with one another. And Spanglish is a good example of that. And that will continue to grow and change and create linguistic innovation, which again, we're interested in. And we're interested in that innovation. It represents the unique human capacity for language. So when a kid says like the verb for lunching in and Christine's the better Spanish speaker, obviously, but is almorzar, right? So you can say I lunch in Spanish. You use it as a verb. I will lunch, I lunch, almorzar. But what kids will sometimes say in Iowa is they use the English term for lunch, and they use the inflection, the Spanish inflection for ear, so lonchear. So they'll say, so it's this mixing that happens where they're using Spanish morphology, an English word, mixing the two. That's an example of Spanglish. Would you agree, Christine? Did I describe that well? You should be the one describing this.
No, no, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, 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 yes.
I kind of experienced, so I took a lot of French in high school and college. And when I started learning Spanish, when I was struggling for the word, I'd come up with a French word and just throw that out. You know, they're similar enough that it's really easy to slip into that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that goes back to that lovely quote from Julie Sedevy that I read at you. And I apologize for reading at you so much, but I just thought that quote was so nice. Kind of the reality of every single, well, we're at no point in time is our knowledge, even for monolingual speakers, is our knowledge of our language static or stationary. We change every time you drive 2 hours south of Iowa City. You're listening to Missouri English, et cetera, et cetera. You speak to people from different formal levels of education, different professionals, different professions, et cetera. So our L1 is constantly changing. And then when you put another linguistic system on top of that, both are changing. And then a third linguistic system, as in your case, where you started to learn French as well. So that goes back to what David was saying. Right. Okay. Are we?
Everyone has multiple language varieties in their verbal repertoire, even if they only identify as having one. I don't even believe in the word monolingual, actually.
Yeah. You're right. I don't think I would either. I would argue very strongly, actually, against that. Mm-hmm.
Would the same thing be true with different generations of heritage speakers? So that, you know, third generation, would that be more locked into a Spanish at a particular point as compared to a second generation here kind of situation?
Well, I'll let Christine answer, but it's sort of related to something I just said, which is like I think it's constantly evolving and changing throughout the generations.
And I think it's also related very tightly to what we say in language acquisition is input. How much input are you getting? If you're a third generation speaker, but you live in a community where Spanish is spoken by 95% of the people around you, you go to Mexico over the summer, you have family members who are speaking to you in Spanish all the time, then you probably will maintain it, whatever that might be. Versus somebody whose parents speak Spanish, but they live in a tiny little town in Iowa with no other Spanish speakers around them, and maybe there's a little bit of stigma related to speaking Spanish, then they probably won't continue to speak Spanish after that first generation. So the context, the amount of input you get is key, absolutely key. And I would also say sense of identity.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm thinking, that the one that you just said, they might either lose it, or if they kept it, might have kept it, but not as alive and not as evolving.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty consistent finding, as Christine said, this third generation, typically by the third generation, we see a shift. This is a claim made by Joshua Fishman, but we do see that even among Spanish speakers, as Christine said. And I would argue that for other languages, it's often much faster than that.
Yeah, I would too.
So my wife's a second generation Thulu speaker, which is a Southwest Indian language, but it was like a one generation loss, basically. She has some receptive knowledge of it, but doesn't speak it. But the question is she still a heritage Thulu speaker? But
yeah, that's getting into a bit of the weeds in terms of linguistics, isn't it? But yes. Okay.
Great.
Any other questions or comments? We're good.
Thanks, Christine. I think it worked.
Terrific. Wonderful. Well, it was very nice to meet all of you guys. Thank you very much for taking the time to attend our talk. And if you have any ideas or questions or comments that come up down the road, please get in touch with us. But thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for your interest in being part of the Public Policy Center and applying for the summer program.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon.